It's called fifth-generation warfare, and I'm here to tell you all about it. I am James Corbett of The Corbett Report, and this is your guide to fifth-generation warfare.
What is fifth-generation warfare?
So what is fifth-generation warfare anyway? And come to think of it, what were the first 4 generations of warfare? Good questions. For an in-depth answer to the latter question, you'll want to read The Changing Face of War, Into the Fourth Generation, a 1989 article from the Marine Corps Gazette co-authored by William S. Lind. And you'll want to watch Lind's presentation on Fourth-Generation Warfare and the End of the Westphalian Order.
This city and every capital in the world is completely oblivious to the fact that it is caught up in a change in warfare so great that it not only makes our current defense and foreign policies obsolete, it essentially makes obsolete the whole framework within which we think about defense and foreign policy. The change is what I call the rise of fourth-generation war, and this is specifically the fourth generation of modern war. We now think of foreign affairs and defense totally within the framework of the state. State armed forces are designed to fight other state armed forces, but that reality is changing. What's happening around the world today in more and more places is that state armed forces find themselves fighting not other state armed forces, but fourth generation forces, non-state forces.
In a nutshell, Lind's thesis is that the modern age of warfare began with the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, which, he opines, gave the state a monopoly on war. From that point on, modern warfare went through 3 generations, namely, first-generation warfare, the tactics of line and column, developed in the era of the smoothbore musket. Second-generation warfare, the tactics of indirect fire and mass movement, developed in the era of the rifled musket, breech loaders, barbed wire, and the machine gun. And third-generation warfare, the tactics of nonlinear movement, including maneuver and infiltration, developed in response to the increase in battlefield firepower in World War I. This, according to Lind and his co-authors, brought us to the late 20th century, when the nation-state began to lose its monopoly on war and military combat returned to a decentralized form. In this era, the era of fourth-generation warfare, the line between civilian and military become blurred. Armies tend to engage in counterinsurgency operations rather than military battles, and enemies are often motivated by ideology and religion, making psychological operations more important than ever. But, some argue, we've now entered a new era of warfare, namely fifth-generation warfare. There's still much debate about what defines fifth-generation warfare, how we know we're engaged in it, or even if it exists at all. Lind, for one, rejects the concept. Various scholars have made their own attempts at defining fifth-generation warfare, or 5GW, like Dr. Wasim Ahmad Qureshi, who identifies it as the Battle of Perceptions and Information, or Chao Liang and Wang Shangshui of the People's Liberation Army, who write of the era of unrestricted warfare, in which a relative reduction in military violence has led to an increase in political, economic, and technological violence. If academic debates about the changing nature of warfare are your thing, then there's plenty of reading for you to do on the subject, from the Handbook of 5GW, a fifth generation of war, to a slew of academic articles. But for the purposes of this presentation, I'm not interested in that debate. In fact, we're going to use a decidedly non-academic definition of fifth-generation warfare from an Al Jazeera article as our starting point. The basic idea behind this term, 5GW, is that in the modern era, wars are not fought by armies or guerrillas, but in the minds of common citizens. There are 2 important things to note about this definition. The first is that fifth-generation warfare is not waged against either standing armies of nation-states or guerrilla insurgents, but against everyday citizens. The second is that the war is not being fought in a battlefield somewhere, but in the mind. Let's expand the definition somewhat to include the fact that this war is being waged at all levels, not just the mental. The gist of it is this: fifth-generation warfare is an all-out war that is being waged against all of us by our governments and the international organizations to which they belong. It's being waged against each and every one of us right now. And it is a battle for full spectrum dominance over every single aspect of your life. Your movements and interactions, your transactions, even your innermost thoughts and feelings and desires. Governments the world over are working with corporations to leverage technology to control you down to the genomic level, and they will not stop until each and every person who resists them is subdued or eliminated. The most incredible part of all of this is that so few know that the war is even taking place, let alone that they are a combatant in it. The best way to understand this war is to look at some of the ways that it is being waged against us.
Information warfare.
Stop me if you've heard this before, but this is an info war, and the powers that shouldn't be are engaged in a war for your mind. Of course, you have heard of InfoWars if you've been in the alternative media space for any length of time, and for good reason. Information warfare is an absolutely essential part of the war on everyone that defines fifth-generation warfare. The most obvious way to understand this is to look at the actual military forces that are engaging in psychological operations against their own citizens.
It says here, a letter from Nova Scotia government sent out to residents to warn about a pack of wolves on the loose in the province was forged by Canadian military personnel as part of a propaganda training mission that went off the rails. The letter told residents to be wary of wolves that had been reintroduced into the area by the provincial and federal governments and warned the animals were now roaming the Annapolis Valley. The letter, which later became public, sparked concerns and questions among residents, but was later branded as fake by the Nova Scotia government, which didn't even know it was the military who was behind the deception. The training also involved using a loudspeaker to generate wolf sounds, the Canadian Forces confirmed to this newspaper. Guys, let that sink in for a second. They created a fake letter from the government, put it out there saying that there's dangerous wolves, and they set up loudspeakers in the area projecting out wolf noises. This isn't just research, this just isn't just a training exercise. They're actively engaging in this psychological operation to scare people using loudspeakers. This is unbelievable.
But it's not just out-and-out military operations by soldiers dressed up in camo fatigues that are part of this fifth-generation infowar. In the war on everyone, the establishment uses every means at its disposal to manipulate the public's perception. Take Richard Stengel, the former editor of Time who bestowed Time's Person of the Year dishonor on you back in 2006, who chaired a Council on Foreign Relations conversation in which he defends the US government's use of propaganda against its own citizens.
Basically, every country creates their own narrative story. And my old job at the State Department was what people used to joke as the chief propagandist job. We haven't talked about propaganda. Propaganda, I'm not against propaganda. Every country does it, and they have to do it to their own population. And I don't necessarily think it's that awful.
Or take Hill & Knowlton, the PR firm hired by the Kuwaiti government to create the Naira deception in the first Gulf War.
They took the babies out of the incubators. Took the incubators and left the children to die on the cold floor.
Who were retained by the WHO in 2020 to identify celebrity influencers who could be used to amplify the scamdemic messaging.
The One World Together at Home event showcased the who's who of top music stars and celebrities, who came together over the weekend for a special broadcast of music, comedy, and personal messages, all in gratitude to those around the world on the front lines of the coronavirus pandemic.
So what can we do? We've got to take care of our healthcare workers and we've got to buy them time by taking care of ourselves.
The event was led by the World Health Organization and the non-profit group Global Citizen.
Or take the UK government's Scientific Pandemic Influenza Group on Behaviours, which outright admits that they use psychological techniques to manipulate the public into fearing the scamdemic, a move that even some of the panel's own members called totalitarian. And no one bats an eyelid. Perhaps the most insidious part of the fifth-generation infowar is that it has become so normalized that everyone knows it is happening, but no one thinks of it as warfare. Of course